Hi, my name is April. Let's talk about books. I read over 20 books in the month of October, and I'm so behind on wrap-ups and on reviews that I'm only going to talk about 5 of them today. First of all, I want to talk about how I pretty much failed at Victober. I had chosen 5 books, but I managed to read 2. The first book was called Agnes Grey. It's by Anne Bronte, and it is about a girl who has lived kind of a sheltered life and her family falls into some financial difficulties, and so she decides that she'll help out by becoming a governess. Her dad is kind of a loser and a do-nothing. Her mom and her sister have babied her entire life, and so pretty much don't think that she's capable of doing anything. So Agnes Grey herself is pretty plucky and admirable, I think, to decide that she's going to go off into the world and do this thing regardless of whether or not her family wants her to or think that she's capable of doing so. So she finds herself in a couple of different situations with families where she's a governess. Agnes Grey finds out that kids are terrible and sometimes their parents are worse. As a teacher, I have discovered that sometimes, yes, this absolutely can be true. And so there were some parts of this novel that I found very relatable on that level. There is a slow burn romance in this novel that I really enjoyed. She and the object of her affection just talk about books for like half an hour while they're taking a walk in the woods, which I think is a great way to start a relationship. Despite all of the troubles that Agnes Grey finds with her reluctant students and her more or less undisciplined families, she still maintains a positive outlook. She doesn't allow it to affect her in a negative way. She doesn't lash out at the kids or the parents. She just kind of internalizes all of the bad things. She is very committed to her faith, and I just liked this as a very quiet and comforting and enjoyable read. I liked this book a lot. The other book that I managed to read for Victober was The Semi-Detached House, and it's by Emily Eden. In this book, an upper-class woman who has a title of some kind. Her name is Blanche Chester. She's a newlywed, and she goes to live in a duplex in the country while her husband is accompanying a diplomat on some sort of trip to the continent. And she's afraid, most likely because she's just going off of stereotypes in terms of her expectations of who's going to live in the other half of this house. She's afraid it's going to be pretty much like this large, boisterous, country bumpkin-like family. And that's pretty much what she winds up with. But what she finds out is that they are genuinely good and sweet and sincere people. And because she's not a mean person herself, she gets along with them really well. They become friends pretty quickly and close friends very soon after that. They're almost interchangeable in terms of their families. They help each other out in different ways. I thought this was such a good story because it's about if you're nice to people, good things can happen. There is one thing that I didn't like about this book, and that is that the family that's kind of seen to be social climbing and more or less the villains of the story are often referred to as a Jewish family, and so I feel like there's some anti-Semitism in here. I understand that that's of its time, but it's still very uncomfortable. It's still heavily implied that the reason they're bad is that they are Jewish. So that is icky. The rest of the book is really good though, and I liked it a lot. I wouldn't say that it's great literature. It's not up there with Dickens. It's not up there with Austen or the Bronte sisters or anything, but it's just a really sweet and quick read. In terms of the other books that I read, I'm only going to talk about 3. The first of these is Hunger by Roxane Gay. This is a book that everybody has talked about on BookTube, and I have not read anything negative about it or heard anything negative about it. I found this to be a very affecting memoir. Roxane Gay has subtitled it A Memoir of My Body. She talks about traumatic events that have kind of imprinted themselves on her body as well as in her mind. She talks about how those traumatic events have affected her and are still affecting her. I found that she is able to articulate some of the things that I've been thinking but unable to speak. And I think that she has a powerful gift in being able to put that emotion on paper. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed this book, but I was affected by it. I admire Roxane Gay for being so courageous in sharing her story, and her humility in the way that she addresses a lot of the issues that she has faced and is still facing is just amazing. I love her so much. The next book that I read, I actually listened to on audio. It's called Pandora's Lab, 7 Stories of Science Gone Wrong, and it's by Paul A. Offit. And this is about some scientific stuff that screwed things up. The first chapter is about opium, and the Sumerians were the first people who discovered that they could consume opium and it'd make them feel good, and they turn bad in a hurry, and it just progressively gets worse, where people will find out, oh well, we can use this for this actually good purpose, and then somebody else will be like, but I can use it for this bad purpose. So it goes like that throughout centuries, where people will say, oh well, this could be a painkiller, and then somebody else says, yay, addiction, let me have some money. And that's more or less how it keeps going. It does talk about the Opium Wars, in which Great Britain more or less forced China to become addicted to opium so that Great Britain, could make a whole bunch of money off it. It talks about how opium and opium products were sold over the counter in the early 1900s as painkillers because nobody knew that it was as addictive as it was. It talks about how morphine was developed, and how somebody thought, oh well, this is going to be great, nobody's going to get addicted to this, and then it of course talks about the opioid crisis that we're currently facing today, especially in the southern United States. So pretty downer chapter. Another chapter is about eugenics, and what I found interesting about this chapter is something that I already knew but needed pointed out to me again, about how in America we're really good about blinding ourselves to our own faults and pointing our fingers at other people and saying, look what you did, that's bad. And so the author in this book points out that Hitler sent people to the US because over here there were people who were super into eugenics and racial purity and all that kind of stuff. So he got a lot of his ideas from us and then took it back to Germany, and of course took it to another level. But we like to kind of glide over that in history and just pretend that the Nazis are the only bad guys, but we bear a lot of responsibility in that ourselves. The third chapter that really hit me was about lobotomies and how it was used overwhelmingly on women, because their husbands or somebody would come in and say, my wife's nagging me a lot, can you help me out with this? So the idea that asking somebody to help out around the house a little bit was an indicator of a mental illness just really pisses me off. But they would do these lobotomies, and then these women, well, they would be cured in that they wouldn't be nagging any longer, but also they would develop these little like involuntary tics, or they would lose the ability to speak, or they would just go and sit in a corner all day and do nothing but stare. And people thought that was great. The overwhelming majority of the lobotomies that were performed in the US, and most of those on women. And it got to be such a business that a man named Dr. Freeman could do like a 6-minute ice pick lobotomy, where you'd go in, he'd stick his ice pick into your eye sockets and you just kind of fiddle around while telling jokes, and then you'd be out of there and, you know, mentally incapacitated most likely. It's not the happiest of books. If you like being mad, I definitely recommend it, but I really like scientific history, and so that scratched that itch for me. And the third book that was really notable for me this month that I read was Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. I finished it, and then a week later it won the Man Booker Prize. So if my recommendation isn't enough, maybe some like fancy pants book club's recommendation is. What I gleaned most from it was the depth of Abraham Lincoln's grief at the death of his son Willie. Willie was 11 years old when he died of typhoid fever, and at the same time, Lincoln was overseeing the Civil War. So he just bore this huge burden of trying to keep his country together and trying to weigh the balance of lives. Like, how many lives was it okay to lose in order to save another number of lives? So there was that sitting on him, and then on top of that, his kid dies. There is a scene that it talks about him going into the mausoleum and gathering Willie's body to him and cradling him and crying over him. And so for me, it really helped to humanize Abraham Lincoln. There's some other stuff with like ghosts and things, and that's great. But for me, what I really took away from this book is that Lincoln was somebody's dad, and he felt that grief, and he was in mourning. And there is a whole chapter about his appearance, and it's taken from like excerpts from historical documents and people's journals and newspapers and so on. And almost every single one of them has a person mentioning that Abraham Lincoln had the saddest eyes they'd ever seen. And I mean, that just hit me so hard. And so, I mean, we have this thing where we put our historical figures on a pedestal, both figuratively and literally. But this kind of helped me to see Abraham Lincoln less as a hero and more as a human. And so that's why I really liked this book. And those are my notable reads for the month of October. If you've read any of those, or if you want to, let me know in the comments down below and we can talk about it. Until then, goodbyes are always awkward. End of video.